Hello, I am O'Neill Oates Jr., and this is my Week 3 Reading Response assignment. Sometimes, in order to recognize the suffering of an individual, you have to have known who that individual was compared to who that individual is now. I chose Mrs. Minnie Wright, also known as Minnie Foster, from the story A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell as the one suffering from trauma. I could tell that Mrs. Wright was in a state of suffering from various descriptions of her throughout the story. For instance, when you look at the monochrome achromatic color scheme of her wardrobe, the little gray shawl, and the black shabby skirt as compared to a time when she wore bright and beautiful clothing. The black shabby skirt had previous sewing lines. To me, this may have suggested that Mrs. Wright may have had to adjust the size of her skirt a few times due to changes in her weight. The depressing and unkempt appearance of her home, and that something of joy would seem out of place inside it. The absence of a social life, regular communication, or interaction with others within her community. The isolation or disconnect forced upon her by her significant other. The discontinuation of activities once treasured, such as singing, going to church, and socializing with others. The noticeable change in the mood and appearance following a major life event, such as marriage. Mrs. Hale speaks of Mrs. Wright's state of being 20 years ago. Is 20 years ago the time that Mrs. Wright married Mr. John Wright? Or should I say, Minnie Foster married Mr. John Wright. The holding on to someone or something lost, unable to move forward, such as in the loss of the bird. Here are a few of the passages that I believe assist my interpretation of the suffering of Mrs. Wright. On page 279 it reads, "Wright was close," she exclaimed, holding up a shabby black skirt that bore the marks of much making over. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 20 years ago. On page 281 it reads, "She was startled by hearing Mrs. Peters say, 'A person gets discouraged and loses heart.'" And there are two passages on page 286. The one reads, "No Wright wouldn't like that bird." Correction. "No Wright wouldn't like the bird. She said after that, a thing that sang she used to sing. He killed that too." The other reads, "I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster," was the answer, "when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. The picture of that girl, the fact that she had lived neighbor to that girl for 20 years and let her die for lack of life, was suddenly more than she could bear." Although Mrs. Wright was the obvious one suffering, I must admit that I also realize Mrs. Hale was suffering as well, for she feels as though she failed her neighbor and, more importantly, her friend, Minnie Foster.